In the summer of 2003, bulldozers were working incessantly on the outskirts of a small French town, removing the last traces of buildings bombed during World War II. The urban revitalization project promised to transform that land, marked by history, into a modern residential complex. But when the blade of one of the machines struck something solid and metallic about 6 feet underground, no one imagined that they had just unearthed one of the greatest unsolved military mysteries of the 20th century. The object that emerged from the earth was a case of brown leather maps, surprisingly well preserved after 6 decades buried. The initials RM were engraved in gold letters on the front, and a small military nameplate still remained legible. Lieutenant Ronald Mitchell, Divisional Artillery, U.S. Army. The case contained not only detailed maps of the region, but also personal documents, photographs, and notes that would reveal an extraordinary story of courage, mystery, and a disappearance that was never officially explained. Ronald Mitchell had disappeared in December 1943 during one of the most secret operations of the war in Europe. At the age of 28, he was considered one of the most promising artillery officers of his generation, specializing in strategic mapping and coordination of precision bombing. His superiors described him as meticulous, courageous, and gifted with an almost supernatural ability to interpret enemy terrain and positions through maps and aerial reconnaissance. When he disappeared, Ronald was leading a classified mission that remained in absolute secrecy for decades. The discovery of the case raised disturbing questions that echoed through the halls of the Pentagon and French military archives. If Ronald had disappeared during a military operation, why were his most important belongings buried in such a careful, almost ceremonial way? The evidence suggested that someone had deliberately hidden those documents, preserving them as if they were a treasure or a message for the future. The maps contained annotations in red ink, marking locations that did not correspond to any officially documented military operation. French military historian Henri Dubois, an expert on Allied operations during the occupation, was called in to examine the documents. As he carefully opened each map and photograph, Dubois realized that he was facing something extraordinary. "These are not just ordinary military maps," he said in his initial report. "These are documents that suggest a parallel operation, something that happened in the shadows of the official war." Ronald's markings indicate knowledge of movements and locations that do not appear in any file we know of. It's as if he's tracking something, or someone specific, a mission within the mission. And so began an investigation that would reveal secrets buried 60 years ago, forever changing our understanding of the events of 1943. The U.S. military archives kept few records about Lieutenant Ronald Mitchell. At the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, researcher Sarah Chen found that most of the official documentation on Ronald had been classified as restricted access indefinitely. What little was left available painted the portrait of an exemplary officer, an engineering graduate from the University of Michigan, specializing in military topography, fluent in French and German. His performance evaluations were consistently exceptional, with comments from superiors praising his unique ability to read the terrain like an open book. But it was through an unexpected source that the first fragments of the truth began to emerge. Margaret Henderson, an 87-year-old retired librarian in Detroit, contacted the researchers after seeing a television report about the discovery on television. Margaret revealed that her late sister, Dorothy Henderson, had worked as a codebreaker during the war and maintained regular correspondence with Ronald. Dorothy never talked about her work, Margaret recounted, but she kept all the letters Ronald sent between 1942 and 1943. She always said that those letters contained clues about something very important that Ronald was investigating. The 23 letters discovered in Margaret's attic revealed a completely different narrative from the official version. Ronald was not just an ordinary artillery officer. He was working directly with American military intelligence on an operation that he himself described as more dangerous than any bombing. In a letter dated October of 1943, Ronald wrote, "Dorothy, I am following trails that lead to places I did not even know existed. The maps I study at night tell a different story than the one we get at official briefings. There are movements that don't make sense, resources being moved to locations that don't officially exist." The handwriting analysis confirmed the authenticity of the letters, but it was the contents of the last correspondence that sent shivers through the researchers. Dated November 28, 1943, just 2 weeks before his disappearance, Ronald wrote with evident urgency, "I have discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about this war. There are operations going on that not even our own commanders know about. I'm documenting everything on my maps, marking every location, every suspicious movement. If something happens to me, Dorothy, remember, the truth is always hidden where we least expect to find it." The letter ended abruptly, without the formal farewell that characterized all his previous correspondence. Dr. James Patterson, a military historian at Georgetown University, was called in to analyze the findings. Patterson had devoted 30 years studying intelligence operations during World War II and immediately recognized the patterns in Ronald's descriptions. This young officer had stumbled upon something significant, Patterson concluded. His letters suggest that he uncovered a network of unauthorized operations, possibly involving diversion of supplies or even unofficial collaboration with local elements. The fact that he disappeared shortly after his last notes cannot be a coincidence. Ronald Mitchell wasn't just a casualty of the war, he was an investigator who came very close to a truth that someone wanted to keep buried forever. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Henri Dubois discovered references to a military operation never documented in the official archives. Working in the basements of the Reims Municipal Archives, Dubois found fragmentary reports from local French officials that mentioned unusual American military movements during the winter of 1943. The documents described convoys arriving overnight, equipment being unloaded in remote locations, and the presence of unidentified U.S. officers through traditional military channels. The name Operation Phantom appeared scrawled in the margins of several reports, always followed by a question mark. Marcel Rousseau, mayor of the small commune of Verzy during the war years, had kept a detailed diary of events in his region. His descendants preserved the handwritten notebooks, which contained disturbing observations about unauthorized military activities. In a December entry of 1943, Rousseau wrote, "The Americans have returned tonight, but they are not the same soldiers we know. These men work in absolute silence, using equipment I have never seen before." The young French-speaking officer perfectly asked me about old tunnels and underground structures. He said he was mapping alternative strategic resources. I didn't understand what he meant, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. The physical description of the American officer exactly matched Ronald Mitchell. Rousseau mentioned a tall blonde man with a small scar on his chin, a detail that appeared in Ronald's military files. Even more telling was Ronald's specific interest in underground structures in the region. The maps found in its case contained precise markings of caves, medieval tunnels, and ancient castle basements, all connected by red lines that formed a complex network across French territory. These notes suggested that Ronald was mapping not only military positions, but an entire hidden infrastructure that could serve purposes not yet understood. The mystery deepened when researchers discovered that several of the sites marked on Ronald's maps had been the scene of significant archaeological discoveries in the decades following the war. In 1952, excavations at a medieval castle near Epernay revealed underground chambers containing priceless artifacts. In 1961, construction work at Châlons-en-Champagne uncovered a complex system of perfectly preserved Roman tunnels. Each of these discoveries occurred in locations precisely marked on Ronald's maps, as if he possessed prior knowledge about archaeological treasures hidden in the region. The most disturbing hypothesis began to take shape. Ronald Mitchell was not just conducting conventional military operations. Their investigations suggested the existence of an organized network focused on the location and potential appropriation of historical and cultural heritage during the chaos of the war. The documents indicated that unofficial groups were using American military resources for purposes that had nothing to do with the traditional war effort. If this theory was correct, Ronald had uncovered a systematic looting operation disguised as legitimate military activity, and his persistence in documenting these activities may have sealed his fate. The question that haunted all the researchers was simple but terrifying. Had Ronald disappeared because he had discovered too much, or because he refused to participate in what he discovered? The search for witnesses of the time led investigators to an extraordinary discovery at the Saint-Joseph nursing home in Nancy. Claude Moreau, a 92-year French veteran, had served as an interpreter for American forces during the occupation. When the researchers showed photographs of Ronald, Claude's eyes lit up with a mixture of recognition and fear. "Monsieur Mitchell," he whispered in a trembling voice, "I knew that one day someone would come to ask about him. I've waited 60 years for this conversation." Claude revealed that he had accompanied Ronald on several unofficial missions during the weeks leading up to his disappearance. According to Claude's account, Ronald had become obsessive in his private investigation. He no longer trusted anyone in the American command, Claude recalled. He said that there were infiltrators among his own superiors, people who were using the war as a smokescreen to enrich themselves. "Ronald showed me lists of names, Americans and Frenchmen, all involved in something he called the real war, a war for treasures, for works of art, for everything that could be converted into fortune after the conflict." Claude described how Ronald secretly photographed documents, copied military orders, and kept detailed records of suspicious movements of convoys and equipment. Claude's most shocking revelation concerned Ronald's final days. The week before he disappeared, he discovered something terrible, Claude said, his hands shaking as he clutched a cup of tea. Ronald had intercepted communications that proved that some American officials were collaborating directly with European private collectors, selling information about the location of treasures hidden during the war. It wasn't just Germans doing it, it was our own allies. Ronald had compiled enough evidence to destroy entire military careers and expose a web of corruption that stretched to the highest echelons of the Allied command. The unofficial will that Claude revealed was devastating. Ronald had made clear instructions. If something happened to him, Claude should look for a specific hiding place where Ronald had kept copies of all the compromising documents. "He drew me a simple map," Claude said, producing a yellowed piece of paper that had been kept in his wallet for 6 decades. Ronald said that if he disappeared, I should wait at least 50 years before revealing anything. He was afraid that the people involved were still alive and powerful enough to silence anyone who knew the truth. The map showed a location just 300 meters from where the original case had been found. The expedition to the place indicated on Claude's map was organized with extreme care. Using metal detectors and professional excavation equipment, the team discovered a military metal box buried approximately 3 meters underground. Inside the box, perfectly preserved in rudimentary plastic bags, were dozens of photographed documents, intercepted letters, lists of names and codes, and most disturbing of all, photographs of American and European officers gathered in locations that were clearly not official military bases. One of the photographs showed Ronald in the background of one of these meetings, clearly secretly photographing the meeting. It was final proof that Ronald Mitchell had not simply disappeared. He had been eliminated because he possessed evidence of a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of the official narrative about Allied conduct during World War II. Analysis of the photographs found in the metal box revealed details that completely transformed the investigation. The forensic laboratory of the Sorbonne University, which specializes in authenticating historical documents, confirmed that the images dated exactly from the period between November and December of 1943. More impressively, the photographs had been taken with high-quality military photographic equipment, suggesting that Ronald had access to advanced technical resources to document his findings. Each image was numbered and accompanied by detailed annotations on the back, written in Ronald's signature handwriting. One of the most revealing photographs showed a group of 12 men gathered in a lavish library, clearly located in a European mansion or castle. 4 of the men wore American uniforms with no identifiable insignia, 3 wore elegant civilian clothes, and the rest appeared to be officers of different European nationalities. In the center of the table, clearly visible, were detailed maps of the Champagne region and various objects that appeared to be ancient artifacts or works of art. The annotation on the back of the photograph, written by Ronald, read simply, "November 22nd meeting. Division of Search Territories present, Colonel Henderson, Major Blackwood, and local liaisons." The name Colonel Henderson sent shockwaves through the military research community. Official records confirmed the existence of a Colonel William Henderson, who had served as a logistics officer in the region during exactly the period in question. Henderson had been responsible for coordinating supplies and transportation for various American units, a position that would give him seamless access to military vehicles, fuel, and personnel for unauthorized operations. More disturbing still, Henderson had been promoted quickly after the war and held high responsibility positions in the Pentagon during the 1950s, before retiring with full honors in 1962. The other photographs systematically documented the structure of the clandestine operation. A series of images showed American military convoys being loaded with crates that clearly did not contain traditional military supplies. Another sequence captured the same group of officers examining maps in different locations, always accompanied by civilians, Ronald identified as experts in antiquities and European art. One particularly damning photograph showed clearly valuable objects, sculptures, framed paintings, and ornate artifacts being carefully packed into American military crates. The most shocking discovery was in the last photograph of the sequence, a blurry image, clearly taken in a hurry, which showed Ronald being confronted by three men in uniform. The photo had been taken from a low angle, as if the camera was being hidden or falling from Ronald's hands. On the back, in hurried handwriting and clearly under stress, Ronald had written, "Discovered. They know I know. Hiding everything now. If something happens, Claude has instructions." This was clearly the last photograph Ronald Mitchell had managed to take, capturing the exact moment when his undercover investigation was discovered by the very men he was documenting. From this point on, Ronald's fate was sealed, and the young officer who had become an accidental investigator would meet an end that would be carefully erased from the official records. The investigation into Colonel William Henderson has opened a disturbing window into the inner workings of the American military machine during the war. Declassified documents from the National Archives revealed that Henderson not only oversaw logistics operations, but also maintained regular contacts with British and French intelligence officers. His transfer orders during the critical period of November and December of 1943 showed an unusual pattern. Henderson had been temporarily assigned to unspecified special operations during the very weeks that Ronald was conducting his undercover investigation. Henderson's psychological profile, compiled for his post-war promotion, painted the portrait of an ambitious and pragmatic officer. Evaluations from his superiors praised his exceptional ability to solve complex problems through unconventional methods, and his natural ability to establish productive relationships with local civilians. These seemingly positive descriptions took on an ominous significance when examined in the context of Ronald's discoveries. Henderson wasn't simply following orders. He was orchestrating a parallel operation that utilized official military resources for private purposes. So, Elizabeth Warren, a war crimes expert at Yale University, was invited to review the documents. Warren had spent 20 years studying cases of cultural heritage appropriation during armed conflicts. What we see here is a textbook example of how legitimate military structures can be co-opted for criminal purposes, Warren explained. Henderson possessed the authority, the resources, and the perfect cover to execute a systematic looting operation. Most importantly, he had the power to eliminate any threat to his operation, including curious officers like Ronald Mitchell. The extent of Henderson's network became clear through analysis of the names mentioned in Ronald's notes. Major Blackwood, identified in the photographs, had served as an intelligence officer with direct access to information on civilian and military movements in the region. His record showed a series of reconnaissance missions that coincided perfectly with the locations marked on Ronald's maps. Pierre Doublon, identified as one of the civilians present at the secret meetings, was actually a Parisian antiquities dealer with extensive connections in the black market for European art. Each member of the network possessed specific skills that contributed to a sophisticated and highly coordinated operation. The most disturbing element of the discovery was the realization that the network had operated with knowledge and possibly even tacit approval from higher echelons. Intercepted telegrams between Henderson and American regional commands contained coded references to special acquisitions and strategic cultural resources. The carefully neutral bureaucratic language masked what was essentially an organized looting operation. Ronald Mitchell had stumbled not only on individual corruption, but on an institutional system that allowed and even encouraged the appropriation of European heritage under the guise of military necessity. His dogged dedication to documenting this discovery had turned the young officer into an existential threat to people who possessed enough power to make any problem go away permanently, along with whoever caused it. Among the most precious documents found in the buried box was a small black leather notebook, Ronald Mitchell's personal diary of the last 3 weeks of his life. Written in faded blue ink, the entries revealed the psychological transformation of a disciplined officer into an investigator, plagued by the magnitude of his discoveries. The first entry was dated December 5th, 1943. I can no longer pretend that I do not see what is happening. Every order I receive, every mission assigned to me is all part of something bigger and more corrupt than I imagined. I'm documenting everything, but I don't know who I can trust anymore. Subsequent entries showed Ronald struggling with the moral dilemma of his situation. On December 8th, he wrote, I discreetly confronted Colonel Henderson about the discrepancies in the transport manifests. He assured me that everything was within the authorized parameters, but his eyes told a different story. I realized that he knows exactly what I'm investigating. From now on, I need to be more careful. I'm copying all the important documents and keeping them in safe places. If something happens to me, at least there will be evidence. Ronald's growing paranoia was palpable in every line, but so was his unwavering determination to expose the truth. The December 12th entry revealed the moment Ronald discovered the true extent of the operation. Today, I saw something that changed everything. Following one of Henderson's convoys, I arrived at a country estate where I witnessed the transfer of at least 20 crates to French civilian vehicles. I recognized some of the objects that were being transferred: medieval sculptures, paintings that clearly belonged to private collections or museums. I photographed everything I could before I was almost discovered by sentinels. This is no longer a matter of ordinary military corruption. It is systematic theft of European cultural heritage under the cover of legitimate military operations. The last diary entries captured the growing sense of isolation and danger that Ronald felt. By December 15, his handwriting had become more hurried and irregular. They know I know. Henderson called me to a private meeting tomorrow. He said he wants to discuss my transfer to new responsibilities. The tone in his voice leaves me in no doubt about his true intentions. I'm finishing organizing all the documents and evidence. Claude has instructions on where to find everything if I don't return. I'm also burying my map case in a location that only I know, like a kind of time capsule. Maybe one day someone will find and understand what really happened here. The final diary entry, dated December 16, 1943, was only a few lines written in evident haste. Henderson cancelled the meeting. He said that he will send me orders in writing. Something is very wrong. I am seeing unusual military movement around my barracks. 2 soldiers I don't recognize have been following me since this morning. I'm going to bury everything tonight and leave the base at dawn. If you cannot return to complete this record, may these words serve as a testimony. Ronald Mitchell tried to do what was right. The truth always finds a way to emerge, even if it takes decades. This was the last known communication from Lieutenant Ronald Mitchell, a young officer who paid the ultimate price for his moral integrity in a war where not all enemies wore German uniforms. The reconstruction of the events of Ronald Mitchell's last night was based on forensic evidence found decades later and late testimony from an unexpected source. In 2040, Marie Blanchard, a French nurse who had worked at the US military hospital during the occupation, sought out the researchers after reading about the discovery in the newspapers. At 83, Marie carried a secret she had kept for 60 years. She had witnessed the events of the night of December 16/17, 1943, when Ronald implemented his desperate plan to preserve the evidence before attempting to escape. Marie worked the night shift at the hospital and often walked the grounds of the base during her breaks. On the fateful night, she noticed unusual activity in the vicinity of the officers' quarters. I saw Lieutenant Mitchell coming out of his room at 2 in the morning, carrying a heavy backpack and a shovel, Marie recalled. He looked nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. I followed him from a distance, worried about his strange behavior. He walked to the ruins of the old convent, where he stayed for almost an hour digging. Marie described how Ronald carefully buried his case of maps in a specific location, marking the spot with privately arranged stones. Marie's account revealed crucial details about Ronald's mental state in his final moments. When he finished burying the case, he stood there for several minutes, as if he were praying or saying goodbye, she said. Then I heard male voices approaching. There were at least 3 men speaking English in low tones. I recognized Colonel Henderson's voice, but the others were unknown to me. Marie hid behind the rubble of a wall to observe what would happen next. What she witnessed would forever change her understanding of the events of that terrible night. The men who approached Ronald were not there for a friendly conversation. Marie described the palpable tension in the air as Henderson addressed Ronald with a false warmth that barely masked his hostile intentions. Henderson said something like, "Ronald, you've been very curious lately." And Ronald replied that he was just doing his duty as an American officer, Marie said. The conversation quickly turned into a confrontation. Ronald directly accused Henderson of leading a robbery operation, and Henderson replied that Ronald had been involved in matters that did not concern him. The discussion escalated when Ronald declared that he had already documented everything and that the competent authorities would be informed as soon as possible. It was at this point that the situation became irreversible. Marie watched, horrified, as the two men accompanying Henderson moved to flank Ronald. "I realized that Ronald also understood the danger," Marie said. "He tried to retreat, but he was surrounded." Henderson made a gesture with his hand, and the two men moved forward. Marie closed her eyes but kept hearing sounds of struggle, muffled screams, and then a disturbing silence that lasted for several minutes. By the time he finally mustered up the courage to look again, Ronald was gone, and the three men were rapidly moving away toward the military vehicles parked on the nearby road. "I knew I had witnessed something terrible," Marie concluded, "but I also knew that as a French nurse on an American military base, no one would take my word for it against that of high-ranking American officers, so I carried this secret all my life, hoping that one day the truth would come out." The morning of December 17, 1943, marked the beginning of a cover-up operation that would last for decades. Official records showed that Ronald Mitchell had been listed as missing in action during reconnaissance patrol at 6 o'clock that morning. The report, personally signed by Colonel Henderson, claimed that Ronald had left alone for a routine mapping mission and simply never returned. No official search was organized, and the case was quickly dismissed as presumed lost due to enemy action. Ronald's family received a standard letter of condolence and a posthumous medal for exemplary service. Forensic analysis of official documents revealed glaring inconsistencies that went unnoticed for 6 decades. Dr. Michael Torres, an expert in document analysis at the FBI, identified at least 12 irregularities in Ronald's disappearance report. "This document was clearly fabricated," Torres concluded. "The dates do not match other military records from the period, the signatures of witnesses are forged, and even more telling, the paper used for the report was manufactured 3 days after the official date of Ronald's disappearance." The evidence suggested that Henderson had carefully prepared an official narrative to explain the disappearance before it even occurred. The investigation into Henderson's movements in the weeks following Ronald's disappearance revealed a pattern of activity designed to eliminate any trace of the clandestine operation. Military transport records showed that Henderson had authorized the immediate transfer of several soldiers who had worked under him during the critical period. These men were reassigned to different theaters of operation, some to the Pacific, others to bases in England, effectively dispersing any potential witnesses who might question the official version of events. Even more sinister was the discovery that Pierre Dublanc, the antiquities dealer identified in Ronald's photographs, had mysteriously disappeared from Paris just 2 weeks after the incident. His store had been abruptly closed, and neighbors reported that men in American military uniforms had been seen removing crates from the establishment during the night. Dublanc was never seen again, and his family received only a brief message claiming that he had left for urgent business in Switzerland. The systematic elimination of key elements of the network indicated that Henderson was not only covering up his own actions, but executing a comprehensive plan to completely erase any evidence of the operation. The most disturbing aspect of the cover-up operation was revealed through U.S. military intelligence documents declassified in 1995. These files showed that Henderson had requested and received authorization for special security operations related to the protection of sensitive information. The bureaucratic language masked what was essentially an authorization to eliminate threats to the operation using official military resources. The American war machine not only allowed Henderson to carry out his plunder operation, but also provided the institutional means to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Ronald Mitchell hadn't just been the victim of individual criminals. He had been eliminated by a system that prioritized his secret interests over the life of an upstanding officer who dared to question immoral orders. The investigation of 2003 took a completely new direction when the team of researchers decided to track down the fate of the objects that Ronald had documented being stolen. Using the photographs and detailed descriptions found in their secret archives, investigators began searching for the artifacts in museum catalogs, auction records, and private collections around the world. What they discovered was a distribution network that extended far beyond European borders, reaching prominent American collectors and respected cultural institutions. The first significant discovery occurred at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A medieval French sculpture, clearly identifiable in one of Ronald's photographs, had been donated to the museum in 1947 by an anonymous collector. Acquisition records showed that the piece had been catalogued as European origin, legally acquired during the post-war period. When confronted with Ronald's photographic evidence, museum curators admitted that the work's provenance had always been questionable, but that the documentation presented at the time seemed adequate by the standards of the time. Dr. Catherine Phillips, an expert on stolen art during World War II at Harvard University, has been called in to lead the international investigation into the fate of the objects documented by Ronald. Phillips had dedicated his career to tracking cultural heritage displaced during conflicts and immediately recognized the importance of the discoveries. What Ronald Mitchell documented represents one of the most sophisticated and systematic plundering networks we know of, Phillips explained. These were not opportunistic takeovers by individual soldiers. It was an industrial operation with international connections established even before the war ended. Phillips's investigation revealed that at least 43 objects documented in Ronald's photographs had resurfaced in museums, galleries, and private collections in 6 different countries. A consistent pattern emerged. All the objects had appeared on the art market between 1947 and 1952, always with documentation of provenance that claimed legal acquisition from anonymous European collectors or family estates liquidated after the war. The dates coincided perfectly with the period when Henderson had held positions of high responsibility at the Pentagon, giving him access to the resources and contacts needed to establish an international distribution network. The most shocking discovery came through Swiss bank files declassified in 2005. Financial records showed regular transfers of large amounts of money from American banks to numbered accounts in Zurich, all authorized by William Henderson between 1948 and 1955. The total value of the transfers, adjusted for inflation, amounted to approximately $50 million in values of 2005. Henderson had not only stolen European cultural heritage, he had systematically converted these treasures into a personal fortune that sustained a lavish lifestyle for decades. Ronald Mitchell had died trying to expose not only military corruption, but one of the largest money laundering and art trafficking operations in modern history, an operation that continued to generate profits for its perpetrators decades after the end of the war that served as its cover. The investigation into Colonel Henderson revealed that the impact of his actions extended far beyond his own life. Henderson had passed away in 1978, taking his secrets to his grave, but leaving behind a family that had benefited substantially from his unexplained wealth. Their children, Robert and Margaret Henderson, had grown up in a Virginia mansion, attended top private schools, and inherited a multi-million-dollar estate, a fortune impossible to amass on a military officer's salary, even with promotions and successful investments. Robert Henderson, now 72, had followed in his father's footsteps in the military, attaining the rank of general before retiring in 1995. When confronted by researchers with evidence about his father's activities, Robert initially denied any knowledge of the clandestine operations. However, further investigation revealed that Robert possessed several of the art objects documented in Ronald's photographs, pieces that he claimed were gifts from European collectors, grateful for their father's service during the liberation of France. Coincidence was statistically impossible. Margaret Henderson Walsh, the colonel's daughter, had become a respected curator in the art world, specializing ironically in European art from the medieval and Renaissance periods. His private collection included at least 6 pieces that appeared clearly in Ronald's photographs, all of which were allegedly acquired through legitimate private collector channels. When presented with the photographic evidence, Margaret initially claimed that the similarities were coincidental, but later technical analysis confirmed that the pieces in her possession were identical to those documented by Ronald, including minor defects and characteristic marks visible in the photographs of 1943. The most disturbing discovery came through the Henderson family attorney, a prestigious Washington firm that had represented the family's interests for 3 generations. Confidential legal documents obtained through a court order revealed the existence of a financial trust established by Colonel Henderson in 1949, fueled by regular deposits of unspecified origin. The trust had been structured to provide continuous income for its descendants for several generations, with specific clauses prohibiting any questioning of the source of the funds. The document included a perpetual confidentiality clause, threatening with total loss of benefits any heir who revealed information about the Colonel's activities during the war. The final showdown with the Henderson heirs took place in a tense meeting at the family's lawyer's office. Presented with irrefutable evidence of their patriarch's criminal activities, Robert and Margaret were forced to acknowledge the reality of their situation. "Our father never told us how he had accumulated his wealth," Robert admitted, his voice breaking. "We suspected that there was something irregular, especially after we started receiving questions from researchers and museums about certain pieces in our possession. But we chose not to question, because to question would mean admitting that our entire life had been built on blood and theft," Margaret added with tears in her eyes. "Ronald Mitchell died because our father chose money over honor. 60 years later, we are still living off the fruits of his crime. There is no forgiveness for this, and there is no way to undo what has been done." The Henderson family, confronted at last with the dark legacy of their patriarch, faced the devastating realization that 3 generations had prospered thanks to the murder of a young officer of integrity who simply tried to do the right thing. The public revelation of the Ronald Mitchell case in 2006 sent shockwaves through the international military, academic, and cultural communities. The U.S. Department of Defense was forced to open an official investigation into the allegations, appointing a special commission to examine all the evidence. Retired General Patricia Moore, chosen to lead the investigation, stated in his first press conference, "If these allegations prove true, they represent a fundamental violation of American values and military honor. No matter how much time has passed, the truth must be recognized and justice must be done, even if belatedly." The official investigation has systematically confirmed all the findings of the independent researchers. Forensic analysis of the original military documents revealed clear evidence of forgery and cover-up. Art experts confirmed that dozens of objects in museums and private collections corresponded exactly to the pieces documented by Ronald. More significantly, analysis of bank and financial records traced a clear pattern of money transfers that directly connected Henderson's activities to sales of stolen art on the international market. The commission concluded that Ronald Mitchell had been eliminated by criminal elements within the American military structure to silence their investigation of extensive illegal operations. International pressure has led to a series of unprecedented corrective actions. The Metropolitan Museum in New York, along with 15 other cultural institutions, has agreed to return works identified as having been stolen through Henderson's network. The objects were repatriated to French museums or returned to the original families when possible. The Henderson family agreed to establish a $20 million restitution fund, financed through the sale of their property and assets, intended to compensate institutions and families who had lost assets through the Colonel's actions. The most important official recognition came through a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery in May 2700. Lieutenant Ronald Mitchell was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, for extraordinary moral courage in investigating military corruption, sacrificing his own life to preserve evidence of crimes against cultural heritage during World War II. The ceremony was presided over by the Secretary of Defense and was attended by French and American dignitaries. Claude Moreau, now 94, was a special guest and spoke emotionally about the courage of his American friend. The creation of the Ronald Mitchell Institute for Military Ethics at the University of Virginia represented enduring academic recognition of Ronald's sacrifice. The institute was established with funds from the Department of Defense and private donations dedicated to the study of military ethics and the prevention of institutional corruption. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had begun the original research on Ronald, was appointed the institute's first director. In his inaugural address, Chen declared, "Ronald Mitchell represents the best of American military character, a young man who chose truth over career, honor over wealth, and paid the ultimate price for his integrity." Their legacy should constantly remind us that true military strength comes not just from weapons and strategies, but from the moral courage of each individual soldier to do what is right, even when they face dire consequences. 64 years after his death, Ronald Mitchell has finally received the justice he deserved, transforming himself from a forgotten footnote to history into a powerful symbol of the eternal need for moral integrity in times of war. 10 years after the public revelation of the Ronald Mitchell case, the impact of his story continued to reverberate through military and cultural institutions around the world. What had begun as the accidental discovery of a buried case had morphed into a global movement for military reform and cultural restitution. Universities in dozens of countries have established curricula devoted to wartime military ethics, using the Mitchell case as a central case study on the consequences of institutional corruption and the importance of individual moral courage. The investigation inspired a systematic review of World War II military archives in several countries. Operation Transparency, launched jointly by the US, the French and British governments, resulted in the declassification of thousands of documents that revealed other smaller corruption networks, though none as systematic as Henderson's operation. More than 200 works of art and historical artifacts were repatriated to their rightful origins, re-establishing cultural connections that had been lost for decades. European families recovered family treasures they thought were lost forever, closing open wounds from war that had never healed properly. The most touching aspect of Ronald's legacy emerged through the letters that arrived daily at the Ronald Mitchell Institute. Active duty soldiers, retired veterans, and even civilians wrote to share their own stories of moral dilemmas faced in military and professional contexts. One particularly impactful letter came from Sergeant Maria Santos, serving in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Mitchell's story has given me the courage to report wrongdoing in my own unit. I know I could face consequences for my action, but I also know that Ronald Mitchell paid a much higher price for his integrity. If he could make the right choice, even though he knew it would cost him his life, I can at least try to follow his example. Claude Moreau, who had become an almost mythical figure as Ronald's keeper of truth, passed away peacefully in 2016 at the age of 96. In his will, he left a final letter addressed to future generations who should remember Ronald Mitchell. The letter read, "I have carried Ronald's secret for 73 years, since that terrible night in December of 1943. I have seen empires rise and fall, technologies transform the world, and entire societies change their structures. But one thing has remained constant: the need for courageous people willing to stand up for the truth, even when it means sacrificing everything." Ronald Mitchell did not die for maps or art treasures. He died because he believed that truth is worth more than life, that honor is worth more than wealth, and that doing what is right is worth more than any personal reward. As long as there are people willing to make this choice, humanity will have hope. In the small French town where it all began, a simple but powerful monument was erected in the exact spot where Ronald's case had been discovered. The inscription, in French, English, and German, read, "In memory of Lieutenant Ronald Mitchell, 1915 to 1943, and all those who chose truth over convenience, honor over wealth, and justice over silence. May your choices inspire us to have the same moral courage in our own testing times." Every December 17th, veterans, students, and ordinary citizens gather at the monument for a simple ceremony of remembrance, not only of Ronald, but of all those who paid terrible prices for his moral integrity. Ronald Mitchell's true legacy transcended the specific details of his story. He has become a universal symbol of the importance of questioning authority when it acts immorally, of documenting injustices even when it seems dangerous, and of never allowing fear of personal cost to stop someone from doing what is right. His story has proven that even when the truth is buried for decades, even when it seems that injustice has permanently prevailed, the moral courage of a single person can eventually illuminate the darkness and bring justice to those who have been forgotten. Ronald Mitchell had become immortal, not through monuments or medals, but through the eternal example that each generation produces individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the truth, and that these people, even when they die in anonymity, eventually become the lights that guide humanity through its darkest moments. Truth, as Ronald had written in his last diary, always finds a way to emerge, no matter how long it takes or how many layers of earth and silence have tried to bury it forever. Ronald Mitchell's story confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. Corruption does not wear a specific uniform, and the real heroes are not always those that the official story celebrates. In 1943, A young lieutenant of 28 discovered that some of the men he was supposed to respect as superiors were actually criminals masquerading as patriots. His choice to document the truth, even though he knew it could cost him his life, reveals the kind of courage that transcends eras and borders. Ronald didn't just fight German soldiers, he faced a far more dangerous enemy, corruption within his own army. What is most impressive about Ronald's journey is not only the fact that he came across something great by chance, but the way he turned this discovery into a meticulous, persistent, and, above all, courageous investigation. Life offered him a crossroads. On the one hand, the possibility of simply following orders, keeping his head down, surviving the war, and maybe even winning some medals that would adorn his uniform. On the other, the risky decision to walk towards the unknown, meticulously recording evidence that could put his own existence in check. He could have chosen the easier road. It would be enough to close his eyes to what he witnessed, pretend that he saw nothing, and in a short time he would be back home alive, carrying decorations on his chest and recommendations in his curriculum that would make him rise quickly in the military hierarchy. Many men in similar situations would have followed this path, and no one would judge them for it. After all, survival is the most natural instinct of the human being. However, Ronald was not an ordinary man. There was a restlessness in him that prevented him from accepting silence as an answer and cowardice as a refuge. By choosing to document every detail, he demonstrated not only strategic intelligence, but also rare courage. He photographed meetings that should never have come to light, collected documents that contradicted the official version of events, and hid evidence in unlikely places, always aware that any slip could cost him his life. It wasn't just a matter of recording facts. It was a daily struggle against fear, against pressure, and against the temptation to give up. The most impressive thing is that Ronald almost always acted alone. There was no applause. There was no audience. There was no immediate recognition. His work was done in the dim light, away from the spotlight, in silence and secrecy. He was not sure that his evidence would ever be seen, nor was he sure that his voice would echo beyond the trenches where he was confined. Still, he persisted. It is precisely at this point that his trajectory becomes exemplary. The greatness of his actions did not lie in the immediate results, but in the unwavering commitment to the truth. This choice reveals something essential about human character. Not everyone is willing to sacrifice their security for the sake of principle. It's easy to have integrity when there are rewards, recognition, or prestige. It is difficult to remain faithful to one's values when the only thing at stake is one's own survival. Ronald proved that there are people who, even in the face of loneliness, risk, and uncertainty, do not allow themselves to be corrupted. He decided to fight not only against external enemies, but against the indifference and silent complicity that so often sustain systems of power. Ultimately, what his story teaches us is that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, only survives when someone is willing to protect it. Ronald understood that turning a blind eye would be contributing to the perpetuation of corruption. He also understood that omission is not neutral. It is a disguised form of complicity. Therefore, he chose the most arduous path, accepting that his life could be shortened, but never allowing his conscience to be stained by cowardice. And that's why his journey continues to amaze us. It reminds us that in any age, there will always be men and women who stand up against imposed silence, who refuse to condone lying, even when it means carrying the weight of loneliness. Ronald has become a symbol of something greater, living proof that even in the moments when no one seems to be looking, there are still those who have the courage to act for justice and truth. 60 years buried in French soil, Ronald's truth waited patiently for his resurrection. This is perhaps the most powerful aspect of the whole story, the inevitability of justice, even when it takes decades to arrive. Colonel Henderson died rich and respected, believing that he had buried his crimes along with Ronald. But the truth has a persistence that surpasses any attempt to silence. Ronald's maps, his secret photographs, his letters documenting disturbing discoveries, everything remained preserved, waiting for the right moment to emerge and reveal the reality behind the official versions. Ronald's transformation from forgotten officer to global symbol of moral integrity shows how a single person can change the world, even after death. His Institute of Military Ethics has already inspired reforms in the armies of dozens of countries. His letters motivated modern soldiers to report irregularities in their own units. Its history has forced museums around the world to re-examine the provenance of their collections and return stolen works to their rightful origins. Ronald Mitchell proved that dying for the truth can be more powerful than living in lies, and that some battles are only won by future generations who inherit the courage to keep fighting. Each of us faces our own moments of moral choice. It may not be a network of military corruption during a world war, but we all face situations where we know what is right and need to decide if we will have the courage to act. Ronald Mitchell's story reminds us that integrity is not an abstract concept. It is a series of concrete decisions we make when no one is looking, when it would be easier to stay silent, when standing up for the truth can be costly. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on your own moments of moral choice, share it in the comments. What situation in your life required courage to do what was right? Like this video if you believe stories like this need to be told, and subscribe to the channel to discover more extraordinary cases of ordinary people who have made extraordinary choices. Because in the end, it's not the generals or politicians who truly change the world, it's people like Ronald Mitchell, and maybe like you, who choose the truth even when it costs everything.